morning light came softly to the Cederberg, as it always did, gentle and golden, painting the ancient sandstone cliffs in shades of amber and rose. Claire Bennet stood on the small veranda of her rented cottage, cradling a steaming mug of Rooibos tea between her palms, watching the sun climb over the distant ridges. She had been here for 3 weeks now, and still each morning felt like a gift. The cottage was simple, whitewashed walls, a thatched roof, 2 small rooms that smelled pleasantly of stone and thatch, and the wild buchu that grew along the garden path. It sat at the edge of a farm property near Driehoek, surrounded by vegetation and silence. The nearest neighbor was 5 kilometers away. The closest town, Clan William, was a 40-minute drive along winding gravel roads. Perfect. Claire sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. The air was crisp and cool. It was early autumn, and the nights were beginning to carry a hint of winter's approach. But the days were still beautiful, clear and bright, the sky an impossible shade of blue that only seemed to exist here in the mountains. She had left Cape Town 8 weeks ago, left her job, her apartment, her carefully constructed life, not permanently, just for 6 months. A sabbatical, she called it, though her colleagues at the accounting firm had looked at her like she was having some sort of breakdown. "You're walking away from the partnership track?" her manager had said, disbelief sharp in his voice. Yes, she was. She had given 8 years to that firm, 8 years of spreadsheets and tax codes, and 14-hour days during audit season, 8 years of answering emails at midnight and working through weekends and telling herself that this was what success looked like. And then, one Tuesday morning, she woke up and couldn't remember the last time she'd felt anything. Not happy, not sad, not angry. Just empty, going through the motions. A machine processing numbers devoid of color or texture or meaning. She had gone to the doctor, expecting to be told she was depressed. Instead, the doctor, a kind woman with gray-streaked hair and gentle eyes, had looked at her and said, "You're not sick. You're exhausted. When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" Claire opened her mouth to answer, but realized she couldn't remember. The doctor had written her a note for medical leave, but Claire had done something else instead. She had walked back to the office, typed up her request for an unpaid sabbatical, and hit send before she could change her mind. Her parents had been worried. "What will you do for 6 months?" her mother had asked. Reluctant. "I don't know," Claire had said, and for the first time in years, that uncertainty had felt like freedom rather than failure. She had always loved history, archaeology, the stories hidden in old stones and ancient art. In university, before she'd switched to accounting because it was practical, she had taken elective courses in anthropology and archaeology. She'd loved them, loved the way the past whispered its secrets if you knew how to listen. So that's what she was doing now. Listening. The Cederberg was home to some of the finest sand rock art in all of southern Africa. Over 2,000 sites scattered through these mountains, paintings that were thousands of years old, created by the sand people who had lived here long before anyone else, who had known these rocks and valleys and streams like the lines of their own hands. Claire had come here to see them, to photograph them, to sketch them, to sit with them in silence and try to understand the hands that had made them, the minds that had conceived them. It wasn't practical. It wasn't going to advance her career, make her money, or impress anyone. But for the first time in years, she was doing something simply because it mattered to her. She finished her tea and went inside to pack her day bag. By 9 o'clock, Claire was hiking. She had discovered the site 3 days ago, a series of rock shelters about 2 hours' walk from the cottage, tucked into a fold of the mountain that wasn't marked on any tourist maps. The farm owner had mentioned it casually when she'd asked about rock art. "There are some paintings up the kloof," he'd said, gesturing vaguely toward the mountains. "Most people don't go there. Bit of a scramble. But if you're keen—" She was very keen. The path, if it could be called a path, wound through stands of proteas and restios, the cape reeds that grew everywhere in the vegetation, their thin stems rustling softly in the morning breeze. The vegetation here was unlike anything else in the world, fine-leaved, drought-adapted, tough as wire. Grey-leaved sugar bushes with their creamy flowers, ericas in 1,000 subtle variations, and everywhere the distinctive silhouettes of proteas, the national flower of South Africa, ancient and strange and beautiful. Claire walked slowly, her camera bag slung over one shoulder, her sketchbook and water bottle in her backpack. She was in no hurry. That was one of the gifts of this time. She could move at her own pace, stop whenever something caught her eye, and simply sit and be present without the constant pressure of productivity and deadlines. A dassie, a rock hyrax, watched her from a boulder, its round body perfectly still except for its twitching nose. Claire smiled at it. "Good morning," she said softly. The dassie regarded her with dark, intelligent eyes, then turned and disappeared into a crack between the stones with surprising speed for something so rotund. The cliff deepened as she climbed, the sandstone walls rising higher on either side. The rock here was a deep reddish-orange, rich with iron oxides, carved into fantastic shapes by millions of years of wind and water, arches and towers and impossible balanced stones. The Cederberg was famous for its rock formations, the Maltese Cross, the Wolfberg Arch, and the Wolfberg Cracks, natural sculptures that looked like they belonged on another planet. This particular kloof wasn't famous, but it was no less beautiful. The walls narrowed, creating a sheltered space where the morning sun slanted down in golden shafts. Ferns grew in the shaded crevices. A small stream trickled between the rocks, probably fed by a spring higher up the mountain. And there, tucked into an overhang about 3 meters up the rock face, was the art. Claire felt her breath catch, the same way it did every time. There was something about these paintings, something that reached across thousands of years and touched something fundamental in her chest. She set down her pack and began the scramble up to the shelter. The overhang was shallow, barely a cave really, just a place where the rock curved inward enough to provide protection from sun and rain. The floor was sandy, scattered with dusty droppings and a few old bird nests in the corners. But the back wall was alive with images. Claire stood very still, letting her eyes adjust, taking it all in. The scent had painted with ochres, earth pigments in shades of red, orange, yellow, and white. The images were delicate, executed with what must have been fine brushes made from feathers or reeds. Some areas were faded, ghostly imprints where the paint had been absorbed into the porous sandstone over millennia. Other sections remained vivid, as though they'd been painted yesterday. There were human figures, dozens of them, engaged in what looked like a dance or ceremony. They were painted in the characteristic San style, slender, elongated, some bent backwards in the posture that scholars call trance stance. The San people were shamanic cultures, with their rock art intimately connected to their spiritual practices and beliefs. And there were animals, always animals. The saint had lived in harmony with the wildlife of these mountains, had known every creature intimately. Here, painted larger than the human figures, was an eland, the antelope that appeared most frequently in Saint Rock art, heavy with symbolic and religious meaning. Its body was shaded with careful strokes to show the curve of its muscles, its horns rendered in precise detail. There were smaller antelope too, probably klipspringers or reebok. And there, near the edge of the painted panel, something that made Claire lean closer. Elephants. a group of them walking in profile, one trunk curled upward. The style was unmistakable, even though elephants hadn't lived in the Cederberg for over a century. But the saint who had painted these images had known them, had watched them, had perhaps hunted them, had certainly considered them sacred. Claire carefully pulled out her camera. She spent the next hour photographing the paintings from every angle, documenting them methodically. Then she set the camera aside and opened her sketchbook. This was the part she loved most. Not just recording the images, but drawing them, letting her hand follow the same lines that ancient hands had followed, trying to understand the choices the artist had made. Why this color here? Why this pose? Why this placement? It was meditative work. The world narrowed to the rock wall and her pencil, and the soft scratch of graphite on paper. Time became elastic, meaningless. The sun moved across the sky outside the shelter, the angle of light shifting gradually. Claire drew the eland first, trying to capture its flowing grace. Then the human figures, dancing or perhaps flying. It was hard to say. The saint's art wasn't meant to be literal. It represented spiritual experiences, trance journeys, the thin places where the physical and spiritual worlds met. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice how late it was getting, until the quality of light began to change. She looked up, startled. The sun was much lower than it should be. The kloof was filling with shadows. Claire checked her watch, and her stomach dropped. It was after 5 o'clock. She'd been here for more than 6 hours. She needed to head back. Now, she quickly packed her sketchbook and camera, took one last photo of the painted panel, and began the scramble down from the shelter. The descent from the rock art site should have been straightforward. Claire had marked the route carefully in her mind. On the way up, noting landmarks, a distinctive split boulder, a patch of bright orange lichen, a protea with a twisted trunk. But in the fading light, everything looked different. She found the split boulder easily enough, but then the path seemed to branch. Had she come from the left or the right? She stood still, trying to remember, but both options looked equally familiar. She chose left, following what seemed like the fainter of the two game trails through the vegetation. After 15 minutes, she realized she didn't recognize any of the landmarks. The kloof had opened into a more expansive valley, but it wasn't the valley she'd walked through that morning. The vegetation was different, more restios, fewer proteas. Claire stopped and forced herself to breathe slowly. Don't panic. She wasn't lost. Not really. She was in a nature reserve, not the wilderness. The cottage was somewhere, probably. She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. She was deep in the mountains, surrounded by sandstone that blocked everything. The sun was touching the western ridges now, painting them in shades of purple and gold. In less than an hour it would be dark, and she'd been foolish. She hadn't brought a headlamp, hadn't expected to stay so late. Claire turned slowly in a circle, trying to orient herself. The sensible thing would be to backtrack to the rock art site, wait until morning, and find her way back in daylight. But she wasn't sure she could find her way back to the shelter now, either, and the temperature was already dropping. She was wearing only a light fleece over her t-shirt, and she had less than half a liter of water left. She chose a direction that felt right, downhill, toward what she hoped was the main valley, and started walking as quickly as she dared. The light faded fast. One moment there were long golden shadows. The next, everything was blue-gray twilight. The vegetation became indistinct shapes. She stumbled over rocks she couldn't see properly, caught her foot in a hidden hole between tufts of restios. And then she came around a bend in the cloth and stopped abruptly. There was a cave entrance. Not a shallow overhang like the rock art shelter. This was a real cave, a dark opening in the sandstone cliff face, about as tall as she was. She could feel cool air flowing out of it, carrying a faint mineral scent. Claire stood at the entrance, peering into the darkness. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight function. The beam penetrated maybe 3 meters before being swallowed by blackness. She could see that the passage continued back into the mountain, the floor sloping gently downward. She checked the time, 6:47 p.m. The sun was now below the ridges. In another 15 minutes, she wouldn't be able to see her hand in front of her face. The idea of spending the night outside in the open was not appealing. It would be cold, probably close to freezing by dawn. And while there weren't many large predators in the Cederberg, there were leopards, rare and shy, but they existed. She'd seen their tracks near the cottage. The cave, at least, would provide shelter. Walls around her, protection from the wind and cold. Claire took a deep breath and made the decision. She stepped inside. The cave was cool and dry, the air perfectly still. Claire's phone light created a small bubble of illumination in the vast darkness. The passage was wider than she'd expected, easily 4 meters across, and the ceiling arched high above her head, disappearing into shadow. She walked slowly, carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The floor was sandy, covered with a fine dust that puffed up with each footfall. She could see her footprints trailing behind her in the phone's light, the first disturbance this sand had probably experienced in years. The passage curved gently to the right, going deeper into the mountain. Claire told herself she'd just walk until she found a good spot to wait out the night, somewhere with a bit of level floor, maybe some protection from any drafts. And then her phone light caught something on the wall. She stopped, her breath catching. There was writing. No, not writing. Symbols carved into the sandstone, worn smooth by time but still visible. Spirals and geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines radiating outward like the sun. She'd never heard of cave carvings in the Cederberg. Rock paintings, yes, but not carved symbols. Claire moved closer, reaching out to touch the stone. The carvings were old, ancient. The edges were rounded, the sandstone weathered smooth, but they were clearly intentional, clearly meaningful. She followed them along the wall. More spirals, more radiating lines. And there, a symbol that looked almost like a doorway. A rectangular opening with another rectangle inside it, and another, creating a sense of depth, of passage into somewhere else. The carvings led her deeper into the cave. She should turn back. She knew she should, but something pulled her forward. Curiosity, yes, but also something else. A feeling, a sense that she was meant to be here, meant to follow these signs. The passage opened suddenly into a larger chamber, and there, in the darkness ahead, was light. Not harsh light, not the white beam of her phone. This was soft, gentle, blue-green light that seemed to glow from within the rock itself. It pulsed very faintly, like a slow heartbeat, like breathing. Claire switched off her phone and stood in wonder. The light was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from dozens, hundreds of small points scattered throughout the chamber like stars. As her eyes adjusted, she could see that they weren't rocks or minerals. They were alive. They were moving. Beetles. Small beetles, each no larger than her thumbnail, with luminescent thoraxes that glowed with that soft blue-green light. They clung to the rock in clusters, their light creating constellations against the stone, patterns that shifted slowly as individual beetles moved, some dimming and others brightening. It was the most beautiful thing Claire had ever seen. She stood frozen, afraid that any movement would break the spell, would send the beetles scattering into darkness. But they seemed unbothered by her presence. They went about their slow, mysterious business, crawling across the stone, pausing, glowing gently, eternal and patient. Remarkable, aren't they? Claire's heart stopped. The voice had come from somewhere in the chamber, deep, warm, with a faint accent she couldn't quite place. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the beetle's light. Scared. Who's there? Her voice came out higher than she intended. Peace, friend, you're safe here. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far side of the chamber, and Claire's breath caught for the second time. He was short, no taller than her shoulder, perhaps 4.5 feet, but he was powerfully built, broad through the chest and shoulders, with arms that suggested immense strength. His face was weathered and brown, seamed with wrinkles that spoke of great age, but his eyes were bright and clear, grey as storm clouds, sharp with intelligence and something else, kindness perhaps. He wore simple clothes, leather trousers, a tunic of some rough woven fabric, and a leather vest. His hair was long and grey, bound back in a thick braid that hung to his waist. His beard was the same grey, carefully braided into 2 thick plaits. He was, unmistakably, a dwarf. "I'm Thorvald," he said, his voice gentle. "Keeper of the light, welcome to the deep places." Claire opened her mouth and closed it again. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Dwarves? Actual dwarves? There were supposed to be myths, fairy tales, stories from old books and fantasy films. But here he stood, solid and real, regarding her with those patient grey eyes. "You look as though you've seen a ghost," Thorvald said, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Sit, please. You've had a long walk, I think, and the night is cold outside. We'll get you some tea, and you can tell us how you came to be wandering in the deep passages." "Us?" Claire managed. As if in answer, more figures appeared from passages she hadn't noticed, other openings leading off from this main chamber. 3, 4, 5 dwarves, all dressed similarly to Thorvald, all regarding her with curious but friendly expressions. A younger dwarf, or at least younger looking, though Claire was beginning to suspect that age was measured differently here, stepped forward with a clay cup in his hands. "Here, miss, it's only robust, but it's warm." Claire took the cup with shaking hands. The liquid inside was indeed warm, smelling of the familiar earthiness of rooibos tea. She sipped it automatically, the warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Thorvald smiled, and his whole face transformed, the severe lines softening into unexpected gentleness. "Come," he said, "you're a guest in the mountain now. We'll see to your comfort, and in the morning we'll guide you back to the surface. But tonight, rest. You're safe here. The mountain takes care of those who respect her." Claire looked around at the glowing beetles, at the dwarves with their kind faces, at the ancient stone surrounding her. And despite everything, despite the strangeness, the impossibility, she felt her fear drain away. She was safe. The mountain would take care of her. Thorvald led her deeper into the chamber, past clusters of glowing beetles, and through an archway she hadn't noticed before. The other dwarves followed, speaking softly among themselves, in a language that sounded like rocks tumbling in a stream, all hard consonants and rolling rhythms. The passages here were clearly not natural. The walls were too smooth, the corners too precise. Someone had carved these tunnels, shaped them with care and skill, over what must have been years, perhaps centuries. And everywhere there were the beetles. They lined the walls in glowing constellations, providing just enough light to see by enough to navigate without stumbling, but not so bright as to be harsh. It was like walking through a cave full of stars. "How far down are we?" Claire asked, her voice hushed. Something about this place demanded quiet. "Not as far as you might think," Thorvald said, over his shoulder. Perhaps 50 meters below the surface at this point, the mountain has many layers, and we live in the spaces between them. How many of you are there? In these particular passages, about 30 families, perhaps 200 souls all told. He paused at an intersection where 3 tunnels met, considered for a moment, then chose the left-hand path. But there are other colonies, other communities throughout these mountains. We've been here a very long time. How long? Thorvald glanced back at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch again. I have been tending the light-bearers for 1,043 years, he said simply. The colony itself is much older. We were here when the sand first painted on the rocks above. We were here when the ice came and went in the far north, when the seas rose and fell, when the mountains themselves were young. 1,000 years. Claire tried to wrap her mind around it, and failed. This dwarf, this being walking calmly ahead of her, had been alive for longer than the Cederberg had been called by that name, longer than any European had set foot in Africa. You're thinking very loudly, Thorvald said, a smile in his voice. I can hear the wheels turning. I'm trying to understand, Claire said. Dwarves, glowing beetles, underground cities. These things are supposed to be stories. All stories come from somewhere, Thorvald said. The surface folk, you humans, you see us sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. We trade with the shepherds now and again, leave gifts for the farmers who respect the mountain. And so the stories spread. Usually they get things wrong. We don't hoard gold, for instance. And we're not particularly good at making weapons. But the core is true. We're here, we've always been here. They emerged into another, larger chamber. This one was clearly lived in. The walls had been carved into alcoves, each fitted with wooden furniture, chairs, tables, shelves. Soft woven rugs covered the floor, and everywhere, carefully cultivated, were more of the glowing beetles, their light creating a warm, gentle ambience that felt surprisingly cozy. A long table dominated the center of the space, hewn from a single piece of wood, some dark, dense timber that gleamed with centuries of polishing. Around it sat more dwarves, old ones with grey beards, and young ones with smooth faces, females with their hair braided elaborately, children who stared at Claire with undisguised curiosity. We don't get many visitors from the surface, Thorvald said, gesturing to an empty seat at the table. Please, sit. You must be hungry. Claire realized she was. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and that had been nearly 12 hours ago. She sat gingerly in the offered chair. Solid wood, carved with intricate spiraling patterns that matched the symbols she'd seen on the cave walls. The other dwarfs made space for her, murmuring greetings. An older female with silver hair and sharp blue eyes passed her a wooden bowl and a spoon. Mushroom stew, the dwarf said. Good and hot. You look like you need it. Claire accepted the bowl gratefully. The stew was thick and rich, filled with chunks of mushroom and some kind of fruit vegetable she didn't recognize. It tasted earthy and savory, seasoned with herbs that had a faint, wild flavor. These mushrooms, Thorvald said, settling into the chair across from her. We cultivate them in the deep chambers. They grow on the walls, fed by the minerals in the stone and the water that seeps down from above. And the tubers, those are wild, but they grow in certain places where the soil is rich. We harvest them carefully, always leaving enough to grow again. Claire ate, listening to the comfortable murmur of conversation around her. The dwarfs spoke in their own language mostly, but occasionally one would translate for her benefit, or Thorvald would explain something. She learned that the colony had 3 main craft traditions: the beetle keepers, who tended the glowbeetles and understood their complex life cycles; the map makers, who explored and documented the vast network of caves and passages; and the gardeners who cultivated the mushrooms and other underground plants that sustained the community. "And what do you do?" asked a young dwarf sitting to Claire's left. He looked to be perhaps 20 in human years, though she was learning not to trust appearances here. "On the surface, I mean. What's your craft?" "I'm an accountant," Claire said, then immediately wished she'd said something else. It sounded so dull, so mundane compared to beetle keeper or map maker. "What's that?" the young dwarf asked. "I work with numbers, money. I help people track their finances, make sure they're not spending more than they earn, and prepare their tax documents." She stopped at their blank looks. "It's very boring," she finished lamely. "All crafts have their place," Thorvald said gently. "Someone must keep track of things, must understand the patterns of exchange. That's important work." "It doesn't feel important," Claire said before she could stop herself. "Not like this, not like tending something that glows, or mapping the deep places. It just feels like pushing numbers around." Thorvald studied her with those storm-gray eyes. "Is that why you're here, in our mountains?" "I'm taking a break," Claire said. 6 months. I was tired. Tired of the numbers. Tired of everything being about the numbers. About productivity, billable hours, and quarterly targets. I just wanted to do something that mattered, something real. "Like studying the old paintings," Thorvald said. "It wasn't a question." "How did you know?" "You have the hands of someone who draws," he said, nodding at her ink-stained fingers. "And earlier, when you thought I couldn't see you, you were sketching. I've watched many scholars, over the years, humans who come to study the ancient art. They all have that same look, that same hunger to understand. You've seen people at the rock art sites? Sometimes we don't usually make ourselves known, but we watch. The old paintings are precious, sacred even. We like to know who visits them, who treats them with respect." He smiled. "You treated them well. You sat with them for hours. You weren't just taking pictures. You were trying to understand them. That matters." Claire felt something loosen in her chest. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "The way the sun artist understood movement, the way they captured the essence of things, rather than just the surface. There's something about those paintings that feels alive, like the people who made them are still speaking, even though they're gone." "They're not entirely gone," Thorvald said. "Their descendants still live. Different languages, different lives now, but the blood continues. And the art, yes, the art speaks. That's its purpose, to carry meaning across time, to hold memory in the stone." "Is that what the carved symbols are?" Claire asked. "In the entrance passage? Memory?" Thorvald's expression grew distant, thoughtful. "In a way, they're way markers. Signs for those who know how to read them. But yes, they also carry memory. They tell the story of how these passages were made, who carved them, and what their purpose is. A dwarf walking those tunnels can read the walls like you might read a book." "Could you teach me?" The words were out before Claire had consciously formed the thought, but once said, she realized she meant them completely. Thorvald regarded her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a slow, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his ancient eyes. "Perhaps," he said, "you'll be our guest for the night at least, and in that time I can show you some things. Whether you remember them when you return to the surface?" He shrugged. "That will depend on you." After the meal, the dwarves began to disperse. Some disappeared down side passages, heading to their own homes. Others gathered in small groups, talking softly, working on various projects. One was polishing a piece of that dark wood, another was braiding leather cord, a third was carefully cleaning what looked like surveying tools. Thorvald stood and gestured for Claire to follow. "Come," he said. "Before you rest, I'll show you the nurseries, the heart of our work here. They walked through more passages, always lit by the gentle glow of beetles. Claire noticed how the colonies were maintained. Small alcoves carved into the walls where beetles could cluster, patches of what looked like lichen or moss that they fed on, tiny channels carved into the stone to direct water to the right places. The beetles, Thorvald explained as they walked, are not native to the surface world. They come from the deep places, from caves and caverns that have never seen sunlight. Different species have different colors. The blue-green ones you see most commonly here, but also gold and silver, and a rare variety that glows faint purple. And you cultivate them, farm them? In a way, but we don't force them. We provide the conditions they need. The right moisture, the right food, the right temperature, and they choose to stay. It's a partnership. They give us light, and we give them care. How long do they live? 50 years or more, in the right conditions. Some of the colonies in our deepest chambers have beetles that are older than I am. He paused at a heavy wooden door, bound with iron. But new generations must always be raised, which is why we have the nurseries. He opened the door, and warm air washed over them, warmer than the rest of the caves, humid and smelling of growth. Inside was a chamber, unlike any Claire had seen so far. The walls here weren't bare stone. They were covered in carefully tended gardens of mushrooms and moss, and strange pale plants that looked like ferns, but grew without sunlight. And everywhere, in specially constructed boxes and shelves, were the beetles. But these weren't the same as the ones in the passages. These were smaller, duller, their light barely a flicker. Lavier, Claire realized, and chrysalises, and tiny pupae nestled in beds of what looked like rotted wood and mushroom compost. Several dwarves worked in the nursery, moving with slow care among the shelves, checking moisture levels, adjusting the temperature by opening or closing vents that led deeper into the mountain, carefully transferring larvae from one box to another as they matured. "This is the work I do," Thorvald said softly, pride evident in his voice. "The work I have done for 1,000 years, tending the light, ensuring that the next generation thrives. It's patient work, careful work, but it matters." He led her to a shelf where a cluster of pupae was beginning to glow, the first faint signs of the luminescence that would one day light the passages. "Watch," he said. Claire watched. At first she saw nothing. Then, gradually, one of the pupae brightened, just slightly, just enough to see, and then another, and another, like stars emerging as the sky darkened, like tiny lights being turned on one by one. "They're waking," Thorvald whispered, "beginning to transform. In another week they'll emerge, and in another month they'll be ready to join the colonies in the passages." "It's beautiful," Claire breathed. "Yes," Thorvald said simply. "It is." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the pupae glow. Around them the other beetle keepers moved quietly, going about their work with the same patient care. Finally Thorvald stirred. "Come," he said, "you need rest. Tomorrow, if you'd like, I can show you more. But tonight, sleep. You're safe here, in the deep places." He led her to a small alcove off one of the main passages. It had been fitted with a sleeping platform covered in soft furs and woven blankets. More glow beetles lined the walls, providing gentle blue-green light. "This is a guest chamber," Thorvald said. "We don't use it often, but it's yours for tonight. There's water in the pitcher if you need it, and more blankets in the chest if you get cold. Sleep well, Claire Bennet. May the stone keep you safe." "Thank you," Claire said. The word felt inadequate for everything she was feeling. Gratitude, yes, but also wonder, and a strange sense of rightness, as though she'd been meant to find this place all along. Thorvald smiled and closed the heavy wooden door, leaving her alone with the glowing beetles. Claire sat on the sleeping platform and pulled off her boots. Her feet ached from hours of hiking, and her legs were sore, but her mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in months, maybe years. She lay back on the furs, pulling a blanket over herself. The beetles pulsed their gentle light. Somewhere far away she could hear water dripping, the sound echoing through stone passages, and underneath everything, so faint she almost didn't notice it, was a deep vibration, the heartbeat of the mountain itself. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. She was safe. The stone was keeping her. Claire woke to the smell of something baking bread, perhaps, or some kind of cake. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind expecting to see the familiar ceiling of her cottage. Instead, she saw curved stone overhead, glowing with blue-green light. The caves, the dwarves, Thorvald. It hadn't been a dream. She sat up slowly, running her hands through her hair. She must look terrible. She'd slept in her clothes, hadn't washed her face or brushed her teeth. But when she found the pitcher of water Thorvald had mentioned, and a basin beside it, she was grateful. The water was cold and clean, with a faint mineral taste. She washed as best she could, then finger-combed her hair and tied it back. When she opened the door, she found a young dwarf waiting outside, the same one who had asked about her work the night before. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "I'm Kyle. Thorvald asked me to bring you to breakfast." "Thank you," Claire said, stepping out into the passage. "What time is it?" Gale laughed. "Time doesn't mean much down here. We mark the days by cycles, work cycles, rest cycles, eating cycles. But if you mean by surface reckoning, it's probably about 7 o'clock in the morning. The sun's been up for an hour or so." They walked through the passages Claire remembered from the night before, though they looked different now, less mysterious, more homey. She saw dwarves going about their morning routines, carrying water from an underground stream, tending to the beetle colonies, working at small forges where the glow of coals mixed with the glow of beetles. The gathering hall where they'd eaten dinner was busy again. Dwarves sat at the long table, breaking their fast with bread and some kind of porridge and mugs of herbal tea. Thorvald sat at the head of the table, deep in conversation with an elderly female dwarf whose hair was pure white. He looked up as Claire entered, smiling. "Good morning. I trust you slept well?" "Better than I have in months," Claire said truthfully. The sleeping platform had been surprisingly comfortable, and the silence of the deep stone had been absolute. No traffic noise, no phones buzzing, no light pollution, just darkness and peace. "Sit, eat," Thorvald said, gesturing to an empty space. "We have fresh bread. We have our own grain stores, and we grind the flour in the old way, and mushroom porridge and tea made from herbs we gather on the surface." The bread was dense and nutty, with a sourdough tang that reminded Claire of her grandmother's baking. The porridge was warm and filling, flavored with something that tasted like honey but wasn't quite sweet, with a faint mineral note. "It's crystallized tree sap," Cale explained when she asked. "The clan William cedars, up on the high slopes, they weep sap that hardens over time. We gather it carefully, taking only enough. It sweetens well." As Claire ate, Thorvald finished his conversation with a white-haired dwarf, and turned his attention to her. "I thought," he said, "if you're willing, I might show you some of our other workspaces today. The gardens, perhaps, and the map rooms if you're interested. Then, this afternoon, we'll guide you back to the surface. Does that sound acceptable?" "More than acceptable," Claire said. "I'd love to see more, if I'm not imposing." "Not at all," Thorvald said. "We rarely have the chance to share our work with surface folk. It's a pleasure to have someone who appreciates it." After breakfast, they set out. Thorvald led her deeper into the mountain, down passages that sloped gradually downward. The air grew warmer and more humid. The glow beetles here were a different variety, gold rather than blue-green, and their light was warmer, more like candlelight. The gardens require more heat, Thorvald explained. So we place them deeper, where the heart of the mountain keeps things warm. They passed through a narrow opening, and suddenly the passage opened into a vast chamber, far larger than anything Claire had seen so far. It was easily the size of a cathedral, the ceiling soaring up into darkness, studded with golden beetle light like stars. But it was the floor that made Claire gasp. The entire chamber had been converted into growing spaces. Raised beds built from carefully fitted stones contained dozens of varieties of mushrooms, some pale white, others deep brown, some growing in delicate filigree patterns, and others in solid masses. Between the beds, larger sections were planted with those strange pale plants she'd seen in the nursery, ferns that grew in the darkness, their fronds silvery green, fed by some process she didn't understand. And everywhere, dwarf gardeners moved among the crops, tending and harvesting and planting with the same patient care she'd seen in the beetle nursery. "This is remarkable," Claire breathed. "I didn't know anything could grow without sunlight." "Most things can't," Thorvald said. "But these species evolved in the darkness, in caves like these. They feed on the minerals in the water, on decomposing organic matter, on the subtle chemistry of the stone itself. We've been cultivating them for thousands of years, learning which varieties grow best, how to improve the soil, how to encourage fruiting." He led her between the beds, naming species as they went. Most of the names meant nothing to Claire, but she listened anyway, fascinated by his obvious knowledge and love for these strange crops. "And this," he said, stopping at a bed where a cluster of pale, almost translucent mushrooms grew in a perfect spiral. "This is one of our oldest varieties. We call it ghostcap. It's mildly luminescent. See how it glows faintly white? And it has properties, medicinal properties. It can heal certain sicknesses and ease certain pains. The surface folk would pay fortunes for it, if they knew it existed. But you don't trade it." "No," Thorvald said simply. "Some knowledge is too precious to share widely. It would be misused, overexploited. Better to keep it here, where it's safe, and use it only when truly needed." They continued through the gardens. Claire saw mushrooms as large as dinner plates, and others no bigger than her fingernail. She saw underground streams channeled carefully through the growing beds, providing precisely the right amount of water. She saw composting chambers where organic waste was broken down into rich dark soil. "Nothing is wasted here," Thorvald said. "Everything cycles. The mushrooms feed us, but their roots also feed the beetles. The beetle droppings enrich the soil. The water that flows through the gardens eventually rejoins the underground streams and flows back to the surface, carrying nutrients with it. It's all connected, all part of the mountain's great system." "Like the paintings," Claire said suddenly. Thorvald looked at her with interest. "Explain." "The sandrock art. It's the same idea, isn't it? Everything connected. The hunters and the animals, the physical and the spiritual, the past and the present. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of a larger pattern." "Yes," Thorvald said, and there was approval in his voice. "Exactly. That's why we respect the painting so much. The Saint understood what we understand, that we're not separate from the world. We're part of it. We're threads in a great weaving." They stood there in the warm mushroom-scented air, surrounded by golden beetle light, and Claire felt something shift inside her, a loosening, a release. For 8 years she'd thought of success as separation, moving up, moving away, distinguishing herself from others. But maybe that was the wrong way to think about it. Maybe real success was about connection, about finding your place in the pattern, your role in the great cycling system. Come, Thorvald said gently, there's more to see. They climbed back up from the gardens, following a different route that took them through passages Claire hadn't seen before. Here, the walls were smoother, more deliberately shaped, and covered with those carved symbols she'd noticed in the entrance passage. These are the learning tunnels, Thorvald explained. Young dwarves come here to study the language of stone, to learn how to read the walls. Each symbol has meaning. This one indicates water nearby. This one marks a passage that leads to the surface. This one warns of instability in the rock. It's beautiful, Claire said, running her fingers over the carvings. They were worn smooth by thousands of years of countless hands doing the same thing. Functional beauty, Thorvald said. The best kind. Beauty that serves a purpose, that helps rather than just existing to be admired. They turned a corner, and the passage opened into another large chamber. This one was different from the gardens or the gathering hall. The walls here were covered floor to ceiling with what at first looked like intricate drawings, then revealed themselves to be maps. Incredibly detailed maps, carved into the stone and filled in with different colors of pigment, ochre reds and yellows, charcoal blacks, white clay, even what looked like ground turquoise. And they weren't maps of the surface. They were maps of the interior of the mountain itself. Claire stepped closer, her eyes widening. The maps showed passages, chambers, and underground streams, all carefully labeled in the dwarven script. Some sections were densely detailed, every twist and turn recorded. Other sections were sketched more roughly, marked with symbols that Thorvald translated as unexplored, unstable, or flooded seasonally. This is our great work, Thorvald said quietly. The thing we've been doing since the colony was founded, mapping the mountain, understanding her bones, her arteries, her secret spaces. How much of it have you mapped? Perhaps a third in total. And that's taken us 10,000 years. He smiled at her shocked expression. The mountain is old and deep and full of mysteries. Every generation of map makers adds more, explores further, and finds new passages. It's work that will never be finished, and that's as it should be. There should always be mysteries, always more to discover. Claire strolled around the chamber, studying the maps. She could see patterns emerging, major arterial passages, smaller tributaries, chambers that occurred at regular intervals. It reminded her of biological systems, of the way blood vessels or tree roots branched and connected. "And what's this?" she asked, pointing to a series of marks that looked different from the rest. Spirals with dots in the center, repeated at regular intervals throughout the mapped area. "Ah," Thorvald said, coming to stand beside her. "Those are the painting chambers, places where the ancient folk left their marks, either your San ancestors or others, even older. We record those carefully and mark their locations. They're sacred spaces not to be disturbed. There are paintings down here, underground. A few. Not many, but some. Places where the first humans ventured into the darkness, carrying torches, leaving their marks. We've preserved them, protected them. One day, perhaps, when the world is ready, we might share their locations with surface scholars. But not yet. They're too precious, too vulnerable." Claire felt a thrill run through her. Unknowns in our rock art, hidden in caves beneath the Cederberg. It was the kind of discovery that archaeologists dreamed of. But Thorvald was right. Some things needed to be protected. Not everything needed to be catalogued, published, and put on display. "How do you decide," she asked, "what to protect and what to share?" "We watch," Thorvald said simply. "We see how the surface folk treat what they have access to, and mostly they do well. The paintings at Sevilla, at Stadsel, they are cared for, preserved, respected. But sometimes," he shook his head, "sometimes people come who care only for their own fame, their own advancement. They would take samples, damage the art to prove their theories, and remove artifacts to museums far away. Those people we do not help, but you're helping me. Are we? Thorvald looked at her with those ancient grey eyes. What will you do when you return to the surface? Will you tell anyone about us, about these passages? Claire opened her mouth and then closed it again. Would she? Could she? Who would believe her if she did? I don't know, she said, honestly. Good, Thorvald said. Uncertainty is honest. It means you're thinking, considering, weighing the consequences. That's wisdom. A dwarf approached from one of the side passages, older than Cale but younger than Thorvald, with a neatly trimmed brown beard and ink-stained fingers. She carried a rolled piece of something that looked like treated leather, covered in fresh drawings. Thorvald, she said, nodding respectfully, the survey of the western passages is complete. Would you like to review before we transfer to the permanent maps? Of course, Ingrid. Thank you. Thorvald took the roll and carefully unrolled it on a large flat stone that served as a work table. Claire watched as he studied the survey, his eyes tracking every line, his fingers occasionally tracing a passage, or tapping thoughtfully on a marked chamber. Ingrid stood beside him, explaining the details and pointing out features of interest. It was like watching two scholars discussing an ancient text, except the text was the mountain itself, written in stone and water and darkness. Good work, Thorvald said finally. Very thorough. And you found the connection to the northern branch? Excellent. That will shorten the route to the upper springs considerably. Ingrid beamed. Thank you, Keeper. I'll begin the permanent transfer this afternoon. After she left, Thorvald turned back to Claire. The map makers, he said, are our explorers, our adventurers. They go into the unknown places, carrying light and survey tools, marking what they find. It's dangerous work sometimes, but essential. Without maps, we would be lost in the darkness. With them, we can navigate, we can plan, we can understand our place in the mountain's great structure. It's like what I do, Claire said slowly, or what I'm supposed to do. Finding patterns in numbers, creating systems to navigate complexity, except, she trailed off. Except, Thorvald prompted. Except it doesn't feel the same. When I'm doing accounting work, I'm not exploring, I'm just processing, following the rules someone else made. There's no discovery in it, no wonder. Perhaps, Thorvald said gently, you've been doing the wrong kind of number work, or working for the wrong reasons. What do you mean? He gestured at the maps. These are numbers too, in a way, measurements, distances, elevations, but they're in service of understanding, of exploration. The numbers aren't the point. They're tools for comprehending something larger. Perhaps the problem isn't accounting itself, but that you've been using your skills for things that don't matter to you. Claire felt something click in her mind. You're right, she said slowly. I don't care about tax optimization or quarterly earnings. I never have. But if I were helping to map something, to understand a complex system, to find patterns that revealed how things work, she looked up at Thorvald. That might be different. There are many mountains to map, Thorvald said. Many systems to understand, both below the surface and above it. They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by centuries of careful work, of patient exploration, of knowledge accumulated one passage at a time. Thank you, Claire said quietly, for showing me this. It's my pleasure, Thorvald said. Now come, there's one more thing I want you to see before we return you to the surface. These are the ancient ways, Thorvald said, his voice hushed. The oldest parts of the colony. Some of these passages were carved by my great-great-grandfather and his grandfather before him. They've stood for more than 6,000 years. Thorvald let her down again, but this time they went deeper than before. The passages here were older. the air more still. Even the Glowbeetle seemed different. Larger, their light more intense, with a faint silver sheen rather than gold or blue-green. The walls here were covered in those carved symbols, but in denser, more elaborate forms, whole stories written in stone. If only Claire could read them. "What do they say?" she asked, gesturing at the walls. "There was a treaty?" "This section tells the story of the founding of the colony," Thorvald said, running his hand along the carvings with obvious affection. "How the first dwarves came to this mountain, fleeing troubles in their homeland far to the north. How they found the caves, discovered the glow-beetles, and made peace with the stone. And this part here, this records the great earthquake of the Third Age, when half the passages collapsed and had to be rebuilt. And this is the treaty with the Sand People, carved 2,000 years ago, when we agreed to respect each other's sacred spaces and share knowledge of the mountain." Thorvald's expression grew sad. They were displaced. "When your European ancestors came, they pushed the San out, took their lands, and killed many of them. Some survived and went to other regions. But here, in the Cederberg, they're gone now. Only their paintings remain. Of course, the Sen were here first. It would have been rude not to negotiate." Thorvald smiled. "They were good neighbors. They taught us which plants on the surface were safe to eat, and where the best water sources were. We taught them safe passages through the mountain during the cold season, showed them caves where they could shelter from storms. It was a good arrangement." "What happened to them? Why aren't they here anymore?" He pushed the door open. "I'm sorry," Claire said. "It's not your fault, child. You're not responsible for what your ancestors did. But you are responsible for what you do now, in your own time, how you treat the land, how you honor the memory of those who came before." He paused at a heavy door, bound with iron and silver. "Remember that when you return to your world above." The silver glow-beetles clustered thick on the ceiling and walls here, and their combined light mixed with the crystal's glow to create an atmosphere that felt almost otherworldly, sacred. Beyond was a chamber, unlike anything Claire had seen yet. It was enormous, as large as the garden chamber, but instead of crops it contained, she struggled to understand what she was seeing. A massive crystal formation rose from the floor, easily 30 feet tall, branching like a tree made of translucent stone. And it glowed, not with beetle light, but with its own internal radiance, a soft white glow that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. "It's alive," she breathed. "This is the heart of the mountain," Thorvald said softly. "Or at least what we call the heart. A formation of quartz crystal that grows from deep below, fed by the mountain's own warmth and minerals. It's been growing for millions of years, and it will continue growing for millions more." Claire stepped closer, drawn by that gentle pulsing light. Up close she could see that the crystal wasn't smooth. It was made of countless smaller crystals, each a perfect hexagonal prism, all growing together, in a complex, beautiful pattern. "Not in the way you mean," Thorvald said, "but in another way. Yes, it grows, it changes. It responds to the mountain's moods. When there's an earthquake, we can see the vibrations in the crystal. When the rains come heavy, it brightens. It's a living record of the mountain's history, written in light and stone. They're drawn to it. The silver variety especially. They feed on the energy somehow. We don't fully understand it. But they thrive here, and their light combines with the crystal's glow to create this." "And the beetles?" He gestured at the chamber, and Claire understood. It was more than just beautiful. It was holy. This was a cathedral, a temple, a sacred space carved by time and geology and patient tending. He moved to sit on a carved stone bench near the wall, and Claire joined him. They sat in silence, watching the crystal pulse its gentle light, listening to the near silence of the deep stone. "We come here," Thorvald said, "when we need to remember why we do what we do. The gardens feed our bodies. The maps guide our feet. The beetles light our way. But this feeds our souls. It reminds us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, something ancient and ongoing and grand. After a long time, Thorvald spoke again. You asked earlier what you'll do when you return to the surface, whether you'll speak of what you've seen here. Yes, Claire said. I can't tell you what to do. That's your choice to make. But I'll tell you this. The mountain has shared its secrets with you, not because you're special, though you are in your own way, but because you were ready to see them. You were open, receptive. You didn't come here seeking answers. You came seeking questions, and that's the right way to approach the sacred. He turned to look at her. When you return to your world, you'll have choices to make about your work, about how you spend your time, about what matters to you. The mountain can't make those choices for you, but maybe what you've seen here will help you make them wisely. Peace is profound, Thorvald said, and sadness at leaving means the place mattered to you. Those are good things to feel. I feel like I should understand something profound, Claire said, like there should be some big revelation. But mostly I just feel peaceful and a little sad, because I know I have to leave. They sat a while longer, then Thorvald stirred. Come, it's time to return you to the surface. The sun is past noon by now, and you have a long walk back to your cottage. The journey back up through the passages felt both too short and endless. Claire wanted to memorize everything. The exact arrangement of the Glowbeetles, the patterns of the carved symbols, the smell of stone and earth and growing things. But already it was starting to feel dreamlike, slipping through her fingers like water. They stopped at the gathering hall, where several dwarves had assembled to say farewell. Caffel was there, and Ingrid the map-maker, and the elderly female with white hair from breakfast. Safe travels, they each said, shaking her hand with surprising gentleness. May the stone guide your feet. Then Thorvald led her through the learning tunnels, up the gradual slope toward the surface. The air grew cooler, drier. The beetles became sparser, and finally she recognized the passage, the entrance tunnel where she'd first seen the carved symbols. Daylight glowed ahead, bright and almost harsh after the gentle beetle glow. They stopped just inside the entrance. Outside, Claire could see vegetation, blue sky, and the angle of sunlight that suggested it was mid-afternoon. This is where I leave you, Thorvald said. But before you go, he reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft leather, a gift from the mountain, from us. Claire unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small lantern, no larger than her palm, made of what looked like glass or crystal, shaped into delicate hexagonal panes. And inside the lantern, glowing softly, were 3 Glowbeetles. They're young, Thorvald said. They'll live for decades if you care for them properly. Keep them somewhere dark and cool. Feed them a little water and honey once a week. They don't need much, and they'll give you light, a reminder of the deep places. I can't, Claire started, but Thorvald shook his head. You can, and you should. They want to go with you, I asked them. You ask them. In a way. He smiled. Beetles aren't chatty, but they make their preferences known. These 3 chose to light your chamber last night, and they've stayed close to you all day. They like you. Let them come. Claire carefully wrapped the lantern again and tucked it into her jacket pocket. Thank you, she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. For everything, for taking me in, for showing me your world, for... She stopped, unable to articulate everything she felt. I know, Thorvald said gently. The mountain knows. Now go. Your world is waiting for you. But remember, the deep places are always here. The stone endures, and if you ever need to remember peace, you can hold that lantern and know that somewhere beneath your feet beetles are glowing and dwarves are tending their gardens, and the great crystal is pulsing its eternal light. He reached out and took her hand, squeezed it once with surprising strength, then stepped back into the shadows of the cave. Claire stood at the threshold for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked out into the sunlight. The walk back to the cottage took less time than Claire expected. Somehow she found the right path almost immediately, recognized landmarks she hadn't even realized she'd noticed on the way out. The mountain, it seemed, was guiding her home. The sun was low but not yet setting when she reached the cottage. She let herself in, set her pack down, and stood in the small main room, trying to reconcile this space with where she'd been. Had it been real, or had she gotten lost, grown disoriented, hallucinated the whole thing in some kind of hypothermic fugue state? But then she felt the weight in her pocket. She pulled out the leather-wrapped lantern and carefully unwrapped it. The Glowbeetles pulsed their soft blue-green light. Real. It had been real. Claire sat down heavily in the cottage's single armchair. Her legs were sore, her clothes were dusty, and she was desperately thirsty, but she felt more alive than she had in years. She placed the lantern on the small table beside the chair and just watched it for a while, watched the beetles moving slowly inside their crystal cage, their light waxing and waning in a rhythm that felt like breathing. What would she do now? That was the question, wasn't it? She still had 4 months left of her sabbatical, 4 months to decide what came next. She thought about Thorvald's words. Perhaps the problem isn't accounting itself, but that you've been using your skills for things that don't matter to you. What did matter to her? Understanding things, finding patterns, mapping systems, but not corporate systems, not tax codes and quarterly reports. She thought about the maps in the chamber, the careful documentation of the mountain's interior. She thought about the San Rock art, those ancient paintings that recorded knowledge, belief, and beauty. She thought about all the systems in the world that needed understanding, ecosystems, cultural systems, historical systems, not to exploit them or monetize them, but to comprehend them, to help protect them, to contribute to the great work of human knowledge. There were research positions, university posts, non-profit work. She had skills, good analytical skills, attention to detail, and the ability to work with complex data. Those skills didn't have to be used for maximizing shareholder value. They could be used for other things, better things. She pulled out her phone. Still no signal. She was too deep in the mountains. But she opened the Notes app and began typing, capturing thoughts before they could slip away. Research conservation accounting. Look into university programs. Contact Prof. Nikosi about volunteering with the Rock Art Preservation Trust. Skills audit. What can I actually offer to organizations that matter? She wrote for an hour, ideas flowing faster than she could type. By the time she stopped, her phone's battery was dying, but she had pages of notes, directions to explore, possibilities to research. No answers yet, but good questions. She made herself a simple dinner, bread, cheese, and an apple, and ate it while watching the Glowbeetles. Then, as the last light faded from the sky and the cottage grew dark, she carried the lantern to the bedroom. She didn't need to turn on an electric light. The beetle light was enough to see by as she undressed and climbed into bed. She lay there in the darkness, watching the gentle pulsing glow, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow she would begin the work of figuring out her next steps. She would research, make calls, send emails, and start the slow process of redirecting her life towards something that mattered. But tonight she was simply here, in this moment, in the small cottage at the edge of the mountains, holding a piece of the deep places in her hands. The stone endured. The mountain remembered. And somewhere beneath her feet, in passages lit by the soft glow of countless beetles, dwarves were tending their gardens, mapping new passages, and sitting in quiet reverence before a massive crystal that pulsed with the mountain's ancient heart. She was part of that now, part of the pattern, a thread in the great weaving. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Epilogue 3 months later. The sun was just beginning to set as Claire locked her car and shouldered her pack. She'd driven up from Cape Town that afternoon, the longest drive she'd yet made back to the Cederberg, and she was tired but also excited. She'd spent the past 3 months in a whirlwind of activity. She'd resigned from the accounting firm, not with anger or drama, just a simple letter saying she wouldn't be returning from her sabbatical. She'd enrolled in a graduate program in conservation science at the University of Cape Town, specializing in data analysis for heritage site protection, and she'd reached out to several organizations working on rock art preservation and documentation. One of those organizations had offered her a 6-month contract position starting in the new year. The pay was terrible compared to her accounting salary. The work would be hard, often frustrating, with none of the clear metrics of success she was used to. She couldn't wait. But first, she wanted to come back here to the Cederberg, to see the rock art one more time before starting her formal studies, and maybe, just maybe, to find that cave entrance again. She'd tried once before, 2 weeks after her first visit, and hadn't been able to locate it. The cliff had looked different, or she'd chosen the wrong valley, or something. She'd hiked for hours without finding anything that looked familiar. But tonight felt different. Tonight she had a sense of direction, of knowing, like the mountain was calling her home. She hiked as the sun set, using a proper headlamp this time, following a path that seemed to appear before her feet, even though she couldn't remember walking this exact route before. And there, in the deepening twilight, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was the opening. Claire stood at the entrance for a moment, her heart beating fast. Then she stepped inside. The carved symbols were still there on the walls, still visible, still meaningful, though she couldn't read them any better than she had 3 months ago. But she recognized them, remembered them. She walked deeper, following the gentle slope down into the mountain, and yes, there, just where they should be, were the first Glowbeetles, their soft light welcoming her home. The passage opened into the main chamber, and Thorvald was there, almost as if he'd been waiting for her. "Welcome back," he said, smiling that warm, ancient smile. "We hoped you'd return." "I brought something," Claire said, pulling a rolled paper from her pack. "A map. Not of your passages, those are yours to keep secret, but of the rock art sites on the surface, documented locations, condition assessments, and recommendations for protection. I thought maybe it would be useful to you for your records." Thorvald took the map carefully, unrolled it, and studied it with those sharp grey eyes. "This is good work," he said finally. "Thorough, respectful. Yes, this will be very useful. Thank you." "I also wanted to tell you," Claire said, the words tumbling out. "I quit my job. I'm going back to school. I'm going to work on rock art preservation and use my data skills to help protect these sites. It might not be much, but it's something that matters." "It matters a great deal," Thorvald said quietly. "The paintings need advocates, defenders, people who understand both the numbers and the meaning. You'll do well." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Thorvald gestured toward the passages. "Come, stay for supper. Meet some of the young ones. They've been asking about you, the human who visited. And tomorrow, if you'd like, I can show you another section of the map chambers. We've been exploring a new area, and I think you'd find it interesting." "I'd love that," Claire said. She followed him deeper into the mountain, into the warmth and light and safety of the deep places, and felt something settle in her chest. A sense of rightness, of being where she was meant to be. The stone endured. The mountain remembered. And she was home. As night falls over the Cederberg, the ancient mountain stands silent against the stars. The wind whispers through the vegetation. A daisy calls from its rocky perch, and deep below the surface, in passages carved by patient hands over thousands of years, beetles glow softly, tended by careful keepers who understand that light is precious, that beauty matters, that some work is worth doing simply because it needs doing. In a small cottage at the edge of the mountains, a lantern glows on a bedside table. 3 beetles pulsing their gentle blue-green light, and in the deep places beneath the stone, an ancient dwarf smiles and returns to his work, knowing that the mountain has made another friend, that the great pattern has welcomed another thread. Sleep well, dear traveler. May your dreams be lit by gentle beetles. May the stone keep you safe through the dark hours, and may you wake tomorrow, knowing that somewhere in the world, patient work continues, gardens growing, passages mapping, light being tended, and that this work matters, even if the world above never knows it exists. The mountain endures, the stone remembers, and the deep places wait, always for those who are ready to see them. Until our next story from the hidden places.